What's up, guys, and welcome back to Bass Fishing Tips. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about the top 5 questions that you guys have about late summer bass fishing. I recruited old ChatGPT again and had it scour the internet looking for the most asked questions about late summertime bass fishing, and we're going to answer those questions for you guys because realistically, we are in the toughest time of year right now to catch a bass. There's really 2 hinge points in the year that I find to be the toughest time to catch bass. One is late winter going into early spring, and then the one we're in right now, late summer going into early fall. And so, to really get over that last little hump of the year, I want to equip you guys with some tools and some techniques and some ideas that you guys can use and you can apply out on the water to go and catch fish right now. And so without any further ado, let's get on to question number 1 that old ChatGPT found for us, and that is, where do bass go when the water is the hottest that it will be all year long? And that's a really good question because the water really is probably the hottest that it's going to be all year long right now. We've really peaked. We've had all summer. We've had a ton of sun. It's warmed and warmed and warmed and warmed, and it's finally hit that pinnacle. I mean, you even go get in a pool this time of year, a lot of times it's going to feel like bath water, and the lake is no different. So where do the bass actually go? Well, it's kind of a loaded question because depending on where you're actually fishing is going to depend on where the bass actually go and where they live. So if we're talking like a big lake, you're talking about guys that go out and fish on lakes, you're going to have a population of bass that live shallow and a population of bass that live out deep. Now, this population of bass that live up shallow, for the most part, they're going to be hanging around some kind of cover or some kind of structure. And the reason for that is that cover or that structure provides for them something that they need to operate in their little life, in their little bass life. And so, if you're fishing on a lake that has grass, that's where a majority of those bass are going to be. They're going to be in that aquatic vegetation because that aquatic vegetation creates cover. It creates something for those bass to get up against, something those bass can use to ambush. And then 2, the most important thing, it creates oxygen, and that oxygen draws in all the other little fish that bass like to eat. So if you're fishing on a lake that has vegetation, that's where a majority, if not almost all of the bass are going to be in that lake. Now, if you're fishing on a lake like a lot of the lakes I have around here that don't have any vegetation, just deep, rocky lakes, a lot of those bass are going to move out deep. And, even in your grass lakes, there's a portion of fish that are going to move out deep. But on your non-grass lakes, a majority of those fish, instead of being up shallow in that grass, are going to be out deep. And the reason they go out deep is a lot of the same reasons that the bass stay up shallow in the grass. There's more oxygen, there's normally cover and structure both that they can get on, and normally that's where the food is going to be at. And so when we get to the hottest times of year, those bass are going to be in those areas. Whatever helps them to just optimize their existence in the world in which they live, that's where those bass are going to be. Now, when we're talking about places like ponds, I think that's a completely different ball game because a lot of the times, in most ponds, like the deepest pond that I think I've ever fished, it was like 20 feet in the center of that pond, and that's a very rare thing to find. Most of your ponds are going to be like maybe 8 to 10 foot deep at the most, and a lot of the times they're not going to have a lot of cover. They're not going to have a lot of structure. Those bass don't really have nothing to get against. And so when you're in a pond scenario, the number one thing I'm looking for is shade. Something that's unmoving, unchanging, like a tree that has always been there, or like a fishing pier that's always been there, or something that doesn't move in that bass's life that bass can get up against. Because a lot of the time that's going to be their kind of only refuge in that pond in which they live, in that barren wasteland that is that pond. A lot of times the only refuge that they're going to have is something that is unmoving, like a tree, a root system on a tree, or a fishing pier, or maybe there's like one of them big like concrete things that act as like a runoff thing, where if the pond gets too full, it'll run down into like a pipe and run down into another area. Something that's unmoving within that pond, that's normally where those fish are going to be. And then if your pond doesn't have those things, what I have noticed is that bass just kind of keep moving. They just move around. They never really stop moving. They're constantly migrating within that pond because the area in which they're living is so dramatically smaller than, say, a lake or something like that, that they've kind of mapped out their whole area in which they live. And so they'll just go from thing to thing to thing, or they'll follow food around that pond, or they'll just avoid stuff within that pond, and that bass is just constantly moving throughout that pond. And so there's no guarantee where that fish is going to be sitting when the water's as warm as it's going to be all year. You just kind of got to go out there, you got to fish, and what's really cool is that every time you go and fish that pond, it's going to be a new experience, because those fish are just constantly roaming around that pond, either avoiding something, trying to eat something, or just because they feel like moving, because there's nothing to sit against, and so they naturally just start to move and want to go check out and see if they can find something different that might not have been there before. And then you've got what is my favorite thing, which is moving water. Anytime that I can find moving water, especially if we're talking about springs, rivers, and creeks flowing into any given body of water, it doesn't matter if it's a pond or a lake or what it is, that's where there's going to be a population of bass that live all year long, but especially when it gets warm outside, because a lot of the times that moving water is going to be dramatically cooler than the rest of that body of water that you're trying to fish. It's going to have a way higher oxygen level, and then there's just going to be a plethora or a lot of food in that area that those bass can eat on. And a lot of the times those bass are way easier to catch in that moving water, just because that current dictates so much of their life, and then it also gets rid of so many factors that could affect those fish, like extreme heat, extreme cold, whatever the extremes are. I mean, right now it's extreme heat, and a lot of times moving water can negate that, and so it helps you to catch more fish. But that's really, to me, like the three big scenarios that I can think that most people are fishing, and kind of what I would keep in mind of where bass actually go when it gets this warm outside. Great first question, really in-depth first question, but hopefully you guys picked a little something out of that first question that you guys can go and use on the water. Question number 2 is going to be, what baits catch the most bass in the late summer? Again, a loaded question, but I think a simple question all the same, because this is something that we've discussed on this channel before. And if you're new to the channel, we got a ton of videos on the channel that you guys can go back and you can check out. And I'll make sure to link some below in the description and the pinned comments so you guys can check them out. And then there will always be one at the end that you guys can click. But I think the best bait to use is something that no one else is using. And I've talked about this in my big worm video and several other videos that I did. I think when bass have seen 1,000 of the same thing, 1,000 of the same crankbait, 1,000 of the same worm, 1,000 of the same chatterbait, frog, whatever it may be, when you can switch up that color or that size, or maybe take the rattles out or put rattles in or something like that, switching up that baiting, showing those bass just a little something different, that's what's going to get these super pressured bass to bite. These bass that at the end of the summer are just lockjawed. They've been stuck 2 or 3 times. They're just not really wanting to participate. Showing them a little something different is going to do a couple things. Number one, it is just something different. A lot of the times a bass, being a very curious creature, if it sees something, senses something, feels something, smells something that's just slightly different than everything else in the environment around it, or that it's been presented with already, the curiosity will kill the cat. They'll go check that thing out, and they'll usually put it in their mouth, because they don't got hands. A bass checks the world around it with its mouth, because it can't grab a hold of something and go, yeah, like that's a hook and I don't need to mess with that. Their brains are very, very simple. They'll just pick that thing up, and a lot of times you can put a fish into the boat bank or the kayak by just showing them something different. And I think that's the big key to what should I throw this time of year. I mean, we've done a lot of videos, and there's a lot of videos on the internet about the staples of any given month or the staples of any given season, and we've all talked about deep diving crankbaits and big worms and jigs and spoons and all of these things, and the bass have seen all of these things. It's really going within that category, doing a deep dive, and maybe picking up a crankbait that doesn't have any rattles, or maybe picking up a worm that's a completely different color than anybody else is throwing, or maybe it's getting a jig and downsizing it, go with that little micro jig instead of the big bulky full-size jig. Those sorts of just changes, especially in a pond fishing scenario where you probably are fishing extremely pressured fish, can get those bass to bite. And so just change it up a little bit. I think changing it up a little bit can help you to put fish in the boat bank or the kayak. Good question again. All right, question number 3. How do I trigger bass to bite in the summer and when they're in that summer slump. And so again, that's kind of that slump or that last hump that we're trying to get over right now this time of year, that late summer just grind that so many anglers, including myself, are in. I mean, right now, it is one of those deals where I'm at in the country that you're either on them or you're off them, and you can be on them one day and off them the next day. So how do we trick those bass into biting? How do we trigger those bites? Well, there's one of two ways to do that. Number one is going to be a reaction bite. And a reaction bite relies on the bass's instinct. So you got to imagine a bass's brain is fairly simple. As complicated as it is and as cool as it is to study, it's still a pretty simple thing. And so a bass kind of has almost a switch in their head. Not obviously a physical switch, this is a metaphor, but they have a switch in their head. And when you hit that switch, the reaction switch, a bass can't help but try to eat or kill something that's passing by its face. And a bass relies on this a lot in its life because they are reactionary predators. They really take chances to eat things. They'll sit, they'll wait, and then they'll ambush whatever comes by them really, really quickly. And that's how a bass operates a lot in its life. That's the number one way. And so reaction style baits are things that are going to move fast or things that we make move fast. And so one of the things I talked about in the worm video that I did is that one of my favorite techniques for actually retrieving that worm is to kind of hop the slack in the line and just barely make that worm move, and then to crack that worm and make that worm shoot up off the bottom and then fall back down. And a lot of the times, we can get a bass's, curious brain to kind of kick in and come over and see what that worm's doing, watch that worm, and then when we crack that worm up off the bottom, that little flip gets switched, that reaction switch gets switched, and they'll lash out and they'll eat that worm before we can even process that they've ate it, and we'll catch that fish. And so that's one way to get those fish to eat. The second one, and probably the hardest way to get them to eat, is going to be just tricking them. Making a lure, and normally these are slower presentations, jigs, Texas rigs, Carolina rigs, slower moving things, tricking that bass into thinking that is something that a bass wants to eat. And one of the things that the book Knowing Bass talks about a lot that I really, really like is that a bass, whatever a bass expects is food is what that bass will eat. And so, a lot of times we talk about matching the hatch, making it look exactly like whatever a bass is eating, but oftentimes if the shape, the sound, the profile, the smell, whatever it is, if one of those things is right and a bass expects that it's food, it's going to try to kill it. And when we're talking about tricking bass into eating, that is one of the most important things that we can do, is just make sure to hit one of those key little areas and actually get that bass to eat whatever it is that we're throwing. And really in the summertime and going into the fall, I like to rely on the reaction bite. I mean, Kevin Van Dam, one of the greatest, tournament anglers of all time, he built his career on the reaction bite. When you think about KVD, you think about crankbaits, and you think about throwing things that move, jerk baits, stuff like that. And that's a lot because Kevin would find big groups of fish, or he would find an area that had a lot of fish in it, and he would just get the fish that would bite something moving. That's the ones that he wanted to get to bite, and oftentimes they're going to be bigger fish if you can get them to react to something. And so I rely on the reaction bite, but you can also trick those bass to eat as well. And so really the trick to getting those bass to eat, I think, is falling back on question, number 2, which is switching it up, showing them something completely different, and then really fishing it in a way and in the area that you would normally fish for these fish, and just getting one of those bass that haven't seen it yet or have seen everything, and just show them something different. Kind of combine question 2 and 3 together into one question and one presentation to get those bass to really get over that hump and through that slump and get those bass to react and to eat something. And so it's kind of a roundabout way. I think that I don't want to sound like I'm trying to divert the question, but I think it's a tough question to answer because every lake is so drastically different. But I think if we rely on understanding that bass react to things that move fast, and that a reaction bite is going to be one of the best bites that we can get on because it's literally an involuntary response to something, and combine that with showing them something completely different, we can get some of those bass to eat really, really well and to put big bass into the bank, the boat, or the kayak. All right, so question number 4. Question number 3 was really good. I actually really liked that discussion. Hopefully you guys did too. Question number 4, what is the best time of day to fish for bass in the late summer? So I'll be honest, the best time of day is actually not during the day. It's going to be night fishing. Night fishing is one of the best ways to catch fish this time of year because there's a lot of bass that just are way more active at night. And a lot of that has to do with how a bass's brain is wired and really how they see the environment around them and how the things that they eat see the environment around them, which makes a bass just a way more like fine-tuned predator at night. And so I think fishing at night is one of the best ways to get bass to bite. And not only because bass just do better at night than the things that they eat, but also because the pressure on the water is going to be way, way down. One of the toughest lakes around me, I mean, probably the toughest lake around me is a lake that's super clear, it's super deep, normally has 15 to 20 foot visibility, and it gets hammered by just recreational boat traffic. You know, pontoons and wakeboards and sea-doos and the whole rigmarole of different, recreational things that happen. And right now is one of the busiest times of year because a lot of the kids are going back to school, but then we'll have that kind of last hurrah at the first of the summer when I think it's Memorial Day, or I think it's Memorial. I always get those two, whatever that first holiday in September is. And so all the people will go back to the lake, and it's just more and more pressure, and everybody's trying to squeeze the last little bit of summer out. And so those bass just get pressured so much. And then you compound that with fishing pressure as well. But at night, that lake completely transforms. It goes from a lake that during the day you would think was literally the Dead Sea and there was nothing living in it, to at night you can go catch some giant bass. And night fishing on that particular lake is some of the best fishing that you will do all year long. And so night fishing to me is the best time of year, or best time of day to go fishing this time of year. And obviously I don't get to do it as much as I used to because it's really hard to film at night. Night fishing is just tough in general because there's not enough, like you turn the lights on, number one, you're going to get literally carried away by the mosquitoes, but there's just not a great way to capture the experience. But some of the best memories that I've had and some of the biggest bass that I've caught during this time of year came during the night bite. And so that's just something to keep in your pocket. I know it's hard. I know it can be tough. And be really safe out there. Make sure you got plenty of lights, and if you're on the boat, on the kayak, or even from the bank, just make sure that you're being safe. But I would say if I had to pick one time of day to go fishing right now, it would be during the night. So nighttime fishing is probably the best time of day to go fishing this time of year. All right, question number 5. When does the late summer to fall transition start? And this is the question that I love the most on this list, and it's because fall fishing is my favorite, and this transition is one of my favorites because it is tough, but there's opportunities to catch big bass. But when does it actually start? Literally right now. It's starting to happen, and the big macro changes are starting to happen, and we don't even realize it yet. When you start to look at the trees, I'm literally looking at trees right outside the beard barn right here, and the leaves on these trees are already starting to get duller. Some of them are already starting to get a little bit of yellow. I got this big oak in my front yard. The very tips of those limbs, those leaves on the very tips, they're getting that kind of yellowish hue to them. And so that sun is physically getting lower in the sky where the earth is tilting away from the sun. And as that starts to happen, that photosynthetic process that happens within these trees and within these plants will start waning more and more and more. And that transition really starts to happen a lot slower than we think it does, and those changes really start to affect fish a lot slower than we think it does. And then we kind of all of a sudden just slam ourselves into, hey, like fall's here, let's go pick up all the fall fishing stuff. And then normally what will happen is we'll have like that first cool day. We'll have like a low in the 40s and highs up in the 60s, and you're like, man, I'm gonna go pick up the topwater and the buzz bait, and like we're gonna go out here and slam some fall time fish. You get to the lake and you don't do very well because you're not focusing on the water temperature. Water temperature is the key to knowing when the fall transition is actually going to happen, because those big macro changes do have an effect. Obviously, these fish notice these things. I mean, they are optimized to live outdoors. We are optimized to live in our little air-conditioned boxes that we live in, and oftentimes we don't sense or feel the changes that wildlife does. And so the bass are starting to notice. But the bass's biggest indicator in its life for so many things that it does, spawn, eat, hide, is water temperature. And so really watch that water temperature. When that water temperature starts to click down, and really start to fall, that's when you're going to start to see the biggest changes happen. And we're really going to see, we go from summer fishing to fall transition to full-blown fall fishing, and we get to get out frogs and topwaters and all the things that we love to throw and we love to catch fish. And so it's happening right now, but it's happening really, really slow. But when that water's temperature starts to reflect those changes is really when they kind of click it down into fourth, fifth, sixth gear and start to let that bad boy eat and really start to pick up speed. And when that fall transition happens really quickly and we get to get on that awesome fall bite that we all love. But that's the top 5 questions that ChatGPT scoured the internet for and found out that you guys are asking about late summer bass fishing. And if you guys enjoyed this video, click this video, it's popping up right here.